For Sarah, love had the face, the voice, and the touch of Mark. He wasn't just a boyfriend, he was a safe harbor, the calm after a long storm of failed relationships and empty encounters. At 32, Sarah, a talented and independent graphic designer, had almost given up on the idea of finding a partner who would fit into her life without trying to dismantle it. And then Mark appeared, brought by mutual friends at an unpretentious dinner, and within a few weeks he didn't just fit in, he became the centerpiece of her universe. He was the personification of the ideal man, an archetype she thought only existed in movie scripts. His presence was constant, but never suffocating. He spent entire weeks at her apartment in the trendy Brooklyn Heights neighborhood of New York City, a space she had decorated with such care, and which, with him, finally felt like a complete home. He wasn't a guest, he was a cohabitant. He helped with the groceries, fixed the dripping faucet, prepared breakfast on weekends, letting the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mingle with the city breeze that drifted in. They planned the future with the natural ease of reading a map. A trip to the Grand Canyon next holiday, a New Year's Eve in Miami, maybe even a sabbatical year to explore Europe. He spoke of our house, our children, our old age, and every word was another brick in the construction of Sarah's castle of dreams. There was, however, one part of his personal map that remained blank, a vast unexplored area, his past. Mark was a book with the first chapter torn out. When Sarah, with her natural curiosity, tried to probe his life before her, he would close up with a disarming gentleness. The answer was always the same, delivered with a calm smile and a comforting squeeze of her hand. "I'm separated. My ex hasn't been a part of my life for a long time. Now it's just me and you." The phrase was a period, a door closed gently but firmly. And Sarah, intoxicated by the happiness of the present, accepted it. Why stir up ashes when you have a bonfire warming your soul? She believed him. She believed him because everything about him seemed true. The way his eyes sparkled when she told him about her day, the way he listened to her most childish fears without judgment, the way his hand always found hers in the dark of the movie theater. Lies could not coexist with such palpable devotion, or could they? Sarah's trust was cemented by Mark's consistency. He wasn't a man of mysterious disappearances or flimsy excuses. If he said he would call, he called. If he promised he would be home for dinner, the doorbell rang promptly at 8. His cell phone wasn't a vault of secrets. It was often forgotten on the sofa, and the messages that arrived were from work, from mutual friends, from his mother, asking if he was eating well. He sent texts throughout the day. A good morning, my love. A funny photo he saw online. A missing you in the middle of the afternoon. He was a conductor of affection that kept her connected and secure. He was the kind of man who made her look at the past and wonder how she had lived so long without him. The kind of partner who made her friends sigh and say, "You hit the jackpot." They had been together for almost a year of happiness so intense and cinematic that sometimes Sarah caught herself waiting for the curtain to close, the credits to roll. She felt like the protagonist of a perfect romantic comedy, and Mark was the impeccable leading man, the prize for all her previous wrong choices. He was proof that it was worth the wait. He was the calm, the certainty, the end of the search. He was the man who made her think, why didn't I meet him sooner? A question that echoed in her mind with gratitude and joy. Little did she know that soon that same question would return, but with a completely different tone, a tone of agony and disbelief, a lament for not having known the truth sooner, the truth that hid behind the perfect smile, the rehearsed devotion, and the locked door of his past. The morning the first crack appeared in Mark's impeccable facade was closer than she could imagine, and with it, the beginning of the collapse of everything she believed to be real. Tuesday dawned with the pale, milky light that precedes sunrise in New York, a light that filtered through the slats of the blinds in Sarah's bedroom, drawing pale stripes across the rumpled bed. Sarah was still immersed in that delicious state of drowsiness, her body warmed by Mark's presence beside her. The sound of his alarm clock, a soft, progressive melody, was the first sign that the day's routine was beginning to impose itself on the peace of the night. Mark stretched, a low murmur escaping his lips, and leaned over to kiss Sarah's shoulder before sliding out of bed. She watched through her lashes with a sleepy smile, his silhouette moving through the room with a familiarity that warmed her heart. He was part of the landscape of her life, as integrated as the books on the shelf or the plants on the balcony. Mark's morning ritual was a symphony of efficiency and care. The sound of water in the shower, the hum of the electric razor, the smell of his soap mixing with the coffee he always left brewing for her. Sarah remained in bed, nestled in the sheets that still held his warmth, listening to the sounds that made up the soundtrack of her happiness. He came out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, the steam forming a halo around his body. They exchanged a smile, one of those knowing smiles of people who share a deep intimacy. He dressed with his usual precision, the light blue dress shirt, impeccably ironed, the grey tailored trousers, the polished leather shoes. He was the image of success, a man who knew where he was going. It was at that moment, in that interlude of domestic normalcy, that the universe decided to move one of its treacherous pieces. Mark was facing away from the bed in front of the mirror, adjusting his wristwatch, a gift she had given him on their 6-month anniversary. His cell phone, which was on the nightstand, vibrated. It wasn't a sound, just a silent vibration, but the screen lit up, casting a bluish, ghostly glow in the dim light of the room. Sarah, who had turned to grab her own phone from the bedside table, saw the notification in a fleeting glance. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't an act of spying. It was an accident, an unfortunate alignment of eyes and timing. But what she read in those fleeting seconds was etched into her mind with the clarity of a neon sign. Reservation confirmed. Table for 2. 18 p.m. The Skyline Room. The phrase floated in the air for an instant, clear and unquestionable. The Skyline Room. One of the most exclusive and romantic restaurants in the city, with a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, famous for its marriage proposals and special celebrations. A table for 2. At 8 o'clock tonight. Sarah's heart leaped, a mixture of surprise and effervescent joy. A surprise. He was planning a surprise for her. The idea flooded her with a wave of tenderness. Mark, always so practical, was setting up a romantic dinner, a delightful cliché that she secretly adored. Maybe it was to celebrate their 1-year anniversary, which was approaching. Maybe, and the idea filled her stomach with butterflies, it was something more. A conversation about the next step, about finally making their life together official, about turning her apartment into our home. Mark, oblivious to the whirlwind of thoughts the notification had unleashed in Sarah, turned around. He didn't even notice the screen had lit up. He just picked up the phone with the casual gesture of someone grabbing their keys and put it in his trouser pocket. He leaned over the bed, the scent of his aftershave enveloping her, and gave her a quick but affectionate kiss on the lips. "Be back later, love." "Busy day," he said, his voice already tuned to professional mode. Sarah smiled, a genuine and radiant smile, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. She held back from saying anything so as not to spoil the surprise he was preparing with such care. "Have a good day, honey," she replied, her voice full of a happiness that he, for a moment, seemed to find curious, but which he attributed to her good morning mood. He left, and the door closed with a soft click. Sarah was left alone in the silence of the room, but the silence was now filled with a vibrant expectation. She got up, feeling light, almost floating. The day stretching out before her was no longer an ordinary workday. It was the antechamber to a magical night. She drank her coffee, the same one he had prepared, but the taste seemed richer. She sat down at her desk, the computer waiting for her design projects, but her mind wandered, imagining the night. What would she wear? The black dress he loved, or the new green silk one she was saving for a special occasion? Throughout the day, Sarah lived in a state of sweet suspense. Every notification on her phone was a small startle. Was it him? A formal invitation? A clue? She checked the messaging app every few minutes, waiting for a "be ready at 7:30" or a "I have a surprise for you tonight." But the hours passed, and Mark's phone remained silent except for the usual trivial messages. "Having lunch now. Thinking of you." Boring meeting, wish I was there. Each message was a small caress, but not the one she was waiting for. The absence of the invitation began to generate a small, tiny seed of unease. She tried to rationalize. Of course, it was a surprise. He wasn't going to ruin everything by sending an obvious message. He would probably show up at home in the late afternoon, with a mysterious smile and a "let's go out." Or maybe he would meet her directly at the restaurant, which would be even more romantic. The anticipation was part of the fun, she told herself. But as the afternoon sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, the seed of unease began to germinate, its thin, icy roots spreading across her chest. It was almost 6 in the evening, 2 hours until dinner. His silence was beginning to feel less like suspense and more like something else, something she couldn't name. Sarah looked at her phone, the dark screen a mirror of her growing anxiety. She reread the notification in her mind, making sure she hadn't imagined it. Reservation confirmed. Table for 2 p.m., the Skyline Room. It was real. The reservation existed. But if it was for her, why the deafening silence? The effervescent joy of the morning began to dissipate, giving way to a fog of confusion. The image of the romantic dinner, of the conversation about the future, began to lose focus, to become blurred. Another possibility, ugly and unwanted, tried to insinuate itself into her thoughts, but she forcefully repelled it. No, not Mark. He was the perfect man. He wouldn't do that. The surprise was for her, it had to be. And she kept waiting, clinging to that certainty with all her might, while the clock relentlessly advanced toward a truth she was not prepared to face. The sun, now a dying ember on the horizon, was dipping below the skyline, and Sarah's apartment was swallowed by the growing shadows of twilight. The light she refused to turn on was a reflection of her state of mind, a limbo between hope and a fear that was beginning to take shape. The clock on the living room wall seemed to have sped up its ticking, each second a small hammer beating against the anvil of her anxiety. It was almost 6 in the evening, 2 hours until dinner. Mark's silence was no longer a romantic suspense. It was an abyss. The image of the perfect night, which had been so vivid and colorful in the morning, was now faded, an old photograph losing its contours. Sarah paced back and forth, from the sofa to the balcony window, the phone in her hand an extension of her body, a useless totem of her weight. She replayed the morning in her head in a torturous loop. The phone's vibration, the lit screen, the words. Reservation confirmed. Maybe she had read it wrong. Maybe it was for another day. Maybe the Skyline Room was the name of a client, a project. She tried to construct logical explanations, alibis for reality, but her mind, trained for the visual clarity of design, could not distort the sharp image she had seen. The truth of that notification was stubborn, inflexible. The reservation was for tonight. It was for 8. It was for 2. And his silence was the piece that didn't fit, the color that clashed with the entire palette. The joy of the morning had turned into a shapeless mass of confusion and foreboding, a tight knot in her stomach. And then, the phone in her hand finally came to life. The screen lit up with his name, and for a fraction of a second, relief flooded her. It was him. The explanation was coming, the invitation. The game of suspense was over. But when she read the message preview on the lock screen, the relief turned to ice, an ice that climbed through her veins and lodged in her heart. She opened the message, her hands trembling slightly. "Honey, I had a last-minute trip. I'll need to sleep out tonight. I'll explain tomorrow." The words hung on the screen, cold, impersonal, definitive. A trip, a last-minute trip. Just tonight. Just on the day of the reservation at the most romantic restaurant in the city. The coincidence was so absurd, so grotesque, that it couldn't be a coincidence. It was a lie. A blatant, poorly constructed lie. An insult to her intelligence. The castle of dreams she had inhabited all day collapsed with the force of an earthquake. And Sarah found herself standing, alone, amidst the rubble of her own naivety. The shiver that ran through her body was not from cold. It was the electric shock of betrayal. The first and unmistakable jolt. Intuition, that ancient feminine voice she had so often silenced with logic and reason, the one that whispered warnings in the dark corners of her mind, this time did not whisper. It screamed. A primal, deafening scream that echoed in every cell of her being. The trip was a farce. The busy day was a prelude to someone else's night. The reservation at the Skyline Room was not for her. It never was. The pain of the realization was sharp, physical, like a knife slowly plunging into her chest. The image of Mark, the perfect man, the devoted partner, began to dissolve, revealing a stranger, a liar. And the question, "Why didn't I meet him sooner?" returned, but now loaded with a bitter irony. She didn't reply to the message. Leaving Mark in the dark, unaware that his lie had been detected, was now part of her unconscious strategy. She dropped the phone on the sofa, the empty dialogue bubble a testament to her refusal to participate in that farce. Her movements became decisive, almost mechanical. She went to the bedroom, not to choose a party dress, but armor. Jeans, a black top, comfortable flats. Clothes for a mission, not a celebration. She tied her hair back in a ponytail, the practical gesture of someone preparing for battle. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were somber, dilated with a terrifying determination. She grabbed her car keys and her purse. She stopped at the door, her hand on the knob, and took a deep breath, the air entering her lungs as if it were solid. A decision formed in her mind, not as a thought but as a decree. If this reservation is for me, she thought, a last pathetic spark of hope refusing to die, I'll be there. And then, the counterpart, the truth she already felt in her bones. If it's not, I'll find out too. There was no turning back. Happy ignorance had been irrevocably lost. Now all that remained was the search for the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The drive to the Skyline Room was a blur. The lights of New York, which she loved so much, seemed aggressive. The headlights of other cars invasive. She drove with fierce concentration, her hands gripping the steering wheel, but her mind was adrift in a sea of scenarios and possibilities, each more painful than the last. Who was she? A colleague, a friend, or the ex who, according to him, hadn't been a part of his life for a long time? The lie about the trip was proof that it wasn't an innocent meeting. It was something he needed to hide. And if he needed to hide it, it was because it was a betrayal. The word, which in the morning would have been a blasphemy, now solidified in her vocabulary. She felt her heart beating strangely, not fast with panic, but with strong, slow, heavy thumps like a war drum announcing an inevitable confrontation. It was as if her own body knew that she was approaching a precipice. Every red light was torture, every green light a push toward the unknown. The feeling was that her heart, with its ancient, irrational wisdom, was trying to warn her that what she was about to discover was not just a lie. It was something much bigger, an architecture of deceit so vast and complex that her life as she knew it would not survive the impact. And yet she kept driving, accelerating toward her own destruction, because the only thing worse than the pain of the truth was the agony of not knowing. The Skyline Room restaurant stood on the edge of the Upper East Side, like a sanctuary of glass and light, overlooking the sparkling darkness of the East River. For most of its patrons, it was a stage for celebrations, a backdrop for happy memories. Tonight, for Sarah, it was a courtroom. She handed the car to the valet with a hand that didn't feel like her own, an automatic gesture performed by a body moving by sheer willpower. Upon entering the sumptuous lobby, the cold air conditioning was a shock against her feverish skin, and the muffled sound of conversations and ambient music seemed to come from very far away. She approached the hostess, a young woman with a rehearsed smile, and her own voice sounded strange to her ears when she asked with a calm that bordered on the supernatural, "A table for one, please, in a discreet spot if possible." The hostess led her through the main dining room, a labyrinth of elegantly set tables, smiling couples and waiters who moved with the grace of dancers. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, or maybe it was just her paranoia, the feeling of being an imposter in that temple of other people's happiness. She was assigned a small table in the corner, partially hidden by a large ornamental plant, but with a strategic and unobstructed view of the entrance. It was perfect. an observation post for the end of her world. She sat down, the chair cold through the fabric of her jeans, and when the waiter approached, all she could ask for was sparkling water. The idea of food or alcohol was repulsive. Her stomach was a knot of anticipation and dread. It was 7:50 p.m., 10 minutes to the hour of truth. Time, which had been flying, now dragged with cruel slowness. Every minute was a small eternity. Sarah fixed her eyes on the entrance door, her field of vision narrowing until nothing else existed. The restaurant, the people, the sounds, everything became a peripheral blur. Her reality was reduced to that glass door and the figure who, at any moment, would cross it. She rehearsed what she would do, what she would say. If he arrived alone, maybe there would be an explanation, no matter how outlandish. If he arrived with a client, a business associate, she would feel like a jealous fool, but relieved. But intuition, that voice that was now screaming in her mind, said it would be none of those options. The clock on her wrist struck 8 o'clock, then 8:01, 8:05. With every passing minute, a part of her, the masochistic and hopeful part, began to weave a new fantasy, that he wouldn't come, that the reservation would be cancelled, that the last-minute trip was real, and everything was just a terrible and unfortunate coincidence. But at 8:07 p.m., the glass door opened, and the fantasy disintegrated like dust. He walked in. Mark, impeccable in his dark suit, his hair perfectly combed, the confident smile she knew so well. For a fraction of a second, Sarah's heart leaped with recognition, with familiarity, with love. She almost smiled. The relief of seeing him, the force of habit, the desperate denial, all conspired to form a phantom smile on her lips. He was there. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe everything would be fine. Until she realized he wasn't alone. He held the door open for the person accompanying him, and when she entered, Sarah's smile died frozen in a grimace of horror. The woman beside him was not a colleague, not a client. She was a woman with a serene face, a gentle smile, and a prominent, unmistakable belly. She was heavily pregnant, the kind of pregnant woman who looks about to give birth at any moment, the elegant dress barely containing the fullness of her motherhood. And the way Mark treated her, it wasn't that of a friend or an acquaintance. He held her hand with a protective delicacy, the other hand resting gently on her back, guiding her over the small step at the entrance. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gesture of such deep, established intimacy that it made the air rush out of Sarah's lungs. The scene was so surreal, so impossible, that for a moment, Sarah's brain refused to process it. It was like watching a movie in an unknown language, the images moving without making sense. Who was that woman? A sister? A cousin? The ex, he said, wasn't part of his life. But the tenderness in his touch, the affection in his gaze, told a story that left no room for doubt. And then the hostess, the same one who had greeted Sarah, approached the couple with an even more radiant smile. And the words she said, loud and clear enough for Sarah to hear from her corner table, were the nails that sealed the coffin of her world. "Good evening, Mrs. Miller. Your table with your husband is ready." Mrs. Miller. His last name, husband. The words echoed in Sarah's mind, ricocheting like bullets. Husband, wife, baby. The ground beneath her feet didn't just open up, it disintegrated, throwing her into a vacuum of darkness and silence. The truth in all its monstrosity hit her with the force of a runaway train. Mark was not separated. Mark was not divorced. Mark was married to that woman. And they were expecting a child due any moment. The pain was so overwhelming, so complete, that it transcended tears. It was a white, blinding pain that paralyzed every nerve, every muscle. Everything she had lived with him over the past year was a lie. Every kiss, every promise, every "I love you." Her house was not their home, it was his hiding place. The weeks he spent with her were not a prelude to a life together. They were a vacation from his marriage. The ex who didn't exist was, in fact, the pregnant wife who was now smiling at him, oblivious to the presence of the other woman just a few feet away. Sarah realized, with a clarity that was the purest form of agony, her true place in that story. She was not the bride. She was not the future. She was not the love of his life. She was the interlude, the distraction, the affair. She was the other woman. The word, the concept, the identity landed on her with the weight of a tombstone. She, Sarah, the independent woman, the talented professional, the loyal friend, had been reduced to that sordid cliché, that pathetic figure she had always scorned in movies and books. She was the mistress, the woman who welcomed another's husband into her bed, who believed his lies, who helped him cheat on a pregnant woman. Nausea rose in her throat, a bitter taste of shame and self-deprecation. How could she have been so blind? How could she have ignored the signs, the locked door of his past, the absence of photos, the lack of connection with his family? Love, she realized, was not blind. It was an illusionist, and she had been the most gullible spectator. The couple was led to a table near the window, one of the best in the restaurant. Mark pulled out the chair for his wife with the same gentleness he had so often used with Sarah. He sat across from her, and they began to talk, their hands clasped over the white linen tablecloth. From her table, Sarah could see his profile, the smile she loved so much now looking like a grotesque mask. She watched, paralyzed, as he placed his hand on his wife's belly, a gesture of proud fatherhood that broke her into a million pieces. That was his future. That was his real world. And she, Sarah, was not part of it. She was a parallel reality, a pocket universe he visited when he tired of his main life. The waiter returned to Sarah's table. "Have you decided yet, Mum?" he asked, his professional voice breaking her trance. Sarah looked at him, her eyes empty. Decided? Yes, she had decided. A strange force, born from the ashes of her humiliation, began to rise up her spine, a cold, silent fury. She wasn't going to stay there, hidden in the corner, crying into her sparkling water. She wasn't going to simply disappear and allow him to continue his farce. He wouldn't have the luxury of never knowing that she knew. He wouldn't have the peace of his lie intact. The pain was still there, a black ocean inside her, but on the surface, a new and terrible resolution had formed. She would get up from that table, and she would walk toward them. The moment Sarah rose from her chair was like the breaking of a dam. The torrent of pain, shock, and humiliation that had kept her paralyzed turned into a current of icy purpose. She was no longer thinking. She was acting, driven by a primal force, a visceral need to tear off Mark's mask and expose the face of the monster hiding beneath. Every step she took toward their table, crossing the restaurant floor, was a step away from the naive woman who had walked in. The sound of her own shoes on the wooden floor was the only thing she heard, a constant mournful rhythm that marked the end of an era. The other tables, the other patrons, were just blurs, ghostly figures in a world that had lost its color and sound. Her entire universe was focused on that table near the window, on that couple who represented the totality of her happiness and the depth of her ruin. She stopped beside the table, a silent apparition that materialized out of nowhere. For a second, neither Mark nor his wife noticed her, immersed in their conversation, in their private world. Mark was laughing at something the woman had said, his face lit up with a genuine joy that made Sarah's stomach clench. The sight of that happiness, built on the foundation of her pain, was the final fuel for her courage. She took a deep breath, the air entering her lungs as if it were thin, and then, with a voice that did not tremble, a voice that sounded surprisingly firm and clear, she said the two words that would detonate the bomb. "Good evening, Mark." The effect was immediate and devastating. Mark's smile froze on his face, shattering like a thin layer of ice. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, almost greenish pallor. His eyes, which seconds before shone with joy, now widened in a mixture of shock, panic, and the purest terror. He looked at Sarah as if he were seeing a ghost, an impossibility, the collision of two universes he had worked so hard to keep separate. The perfect man, the master manipulator, the architect of an impeccable double life had been caught. His expression was that of a criminal caught at the scene of the crime, with no alibi, no escape route. The pregnant wife, sensing the abrupt change in the atmosphere, the tension that suddenly electrified the air, stopped talking. She looked at Mark's transfigured face, and then at the unknown woman standing by the table. Her expression was one of pure confusion, like someone who doesn't get the joke, who wasn't included in the secret. She looked at Sarah from head to toe with an innocent curiosity and then turned to her husband, the question on her lips the most natural thing in the world. "Do you know her?" The question, so simple and direct, hung in the air, loaded with a weight the woman could not imagine. Mark opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, his mind probably racing 1,000 miles an hour, trying to find a lie, any lie that could contain that disaster. But before he could formulate a single syllable, Sarah answered for him. She turned to the pregnant woman, and on her face was a smile, but it was the saddest, most desolate smile in the world, a smile that was the epitaph of her love. "I do," Sarah said, her voice soft but cutting. "For almost a year. He stays at my place when he tells you he's traveling for work." The world stopped. Mark's wife froze, the hand holding a glass of water paralyzed in the air. Her eyes, previously confused, now slowly widened as the terrible meaning of Sarah's words seeped into her consciousness. Stays at my place. Traveling for work. The pieces of the puzzle, the absences, the sudden trips, the unanswered calls, began to fit together, forming a monstrous image. She looked at Mark, no longer with confusion, but with the dawning of horror. But Sarah didn't allow him to speak. She ignored him completely, as if he were an insignificant background noise. Her focus was entirely on the other woman, the other victim. There was a strange and painful solidarity in that moment, the union of two women deceived by the same man. "He told me he was separated," Sarah continued, each word a shovelful of dirt thrown onto the coffin of her illusions. "That you were history, that you no longer existed, and that I was going to be his wife." With each sentence, Mark's wife's face crumbled a little more. The mention of being history, of no longer existing, seemed to hit her with particular force. She brought her free hand to her prominent belly, an instinctive gesture of protection, as if trying to shield her unborn child from the filth of that revelation. She began to breathe deeply, gasping, struggling to remain calm, not to collapse right there in the middle of the restaurant. And then she spoke, her voice a thread, almost inaudible but loaded with the weight of a reality that contradicted everything Sarah had just said. "Separated?" she repeated, the word sounding like an absurdity. She looked at Mark, and for the first time, there was a flame of anger in her tear-filled eyes. "He slept with me last night. He set up the crib this morning." Those two sentences, so domestic, so mundane, were the coup de grace for Sarah. Slept with me last night. Set up the crib this morning. The image of Mark, the devoted lover who spent weeks at her house, was overlaid by the image of Mark, the husband who slept with his pregnant wife, the father who assembled the crib for the child who was about to arrive. His double life was not a matter of choosing between two women, it was a matter of managing two complete lives with a coldness and detachment that were simply inhuman. He wasn't divided, he was duplicated. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, a wave of dizziness and nausea hitting her. The pain was so intense that she felt her knees buckle, destroyed. There was no other word. She had been completely and irrevocably destroyed. The sound of the restaurant, which had previously disappeared, now returned but distorted. She could feel the stares, the silence at nearby tables, the whispers. The entire restaurant was watching. Private humiliation had become a public spectacle. Mark, sweating cold, his face a mask of despair, finally made a move. He reached out to touch his wife's arm, a gesture of supplication, an attempt at control. But she recoiled from him with violent repulsion, as if his touch burned. The gesture was small, but definitive. It was the first physical consequence of his lies, the first wall rising between them. He was left with his hand suspended in the air, a man rejected by both his worlds, exposed and pathetic in his newly created solitude. The truth once released could no longer be contained, and it was only just beginning its demolition work. The air around the table became thin, heavy with what was left unsaid and what was so brutally revealed. The retreat of Mark's wife was a silent earthquake, a shockwave that redefined the landscape of that night forever. Mark, with his hand still suspended in the empty space where his wife had been, was the image of desolation, a deposed king at his own banquet. The wife, whose name Sarah still didn't know, took a deep breath once more, no longer with panic, but with a strange and terrible serenity. The tears streaming down her face were not of hysteria, but of a deep, silent pain. The tears of someone who has just witnessed the death of a future. With a slow, deliberate movement that drew the eyes of the entire restaurant, she raised her left hand. Her fingers slid over the gold wedding band on her ring finger, a ring that had probably never left there since her wedding day. She turned it once, twice, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Then, with a firmness that contrasted with the tears on her face, she pulled the ring off and it came away with an almost audible reluctance. She held it between her thumb and forefinger for an instant, the small circle of gold shining under the restaurant light, a symbol of broken promises and a life of lies. And then she placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth. The small click of the metal against the wood, muffled by the fabric, sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. "It's over, Mark," she said, her voice low but resonating with the finality of a sentence. "I will not raise my child in a house built on lies, and I will not share you with anyone." She didn't look at him again. Her gaze, full of a pain that mirrored Sarah's, turned to the other woman. For a long moment, the two stared at each other, the wife and the mistress, united by a betrayal that placed them on opposite sides of a war neither of them asked to fight. There was no triumph in Sarah's eyes, only shared devastation. And in the wife's gaze, surprisingly, there was no hatred. There was a weary understanding, an empathy born of mutual ruin. "I'm not angry at you," said the wife, her voice still a whisper, but now directed at Sarah. "He deceived us. We are both victims of his deceit." Those words, an unexpected absolution, an acknowledgement of their shared victimization, hit Sarah harder than any accusation. The solidarity coming from the woman she had unknowingly helped betray was an act of grace so profound that it left her speechless. The wife, Elizabeth, rose with difficulty, her immense belly a physical and painful reminder of what was at stake. She held her abdomen with both hands as if to protect her child, not only from the scene, but from the very essence of his father's lie. Without a second glance at Mark, she turned and began to walk out of the restaurant, her head held high, a queen in her exile, leaving behind a husband, a wedding ring, and the wreckage of a life. Sarah watched her go, a figure of admirable strength and dignity. She saw her pass through the door and disappear into the night, probably to call a cab and begin the painful process of dismantling a life. With her departure, the energy of the confrontation dissipated, leaving only a cold, desolate emptiness. Now it was just Sarah and Mark, alone on the island of their destroyed table, under the curious and pitying eyes of the entire restaurant. Sarah turned to him one last time. He was staring at her, his face a mask of pathetic supplication. He seemed about to speak, to try to explain himself, to weave another of his lies, to try to mend the unfixable. But Sarah raised her hand, a simple gesture that silenced him. There was nothing left to say. "You destroyed 2 lives in one night," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, which made it even more cutting. "Mine and hers. And the only trip you're taking now," she paused, letting the weight of her next words settle, "is alone." And with that, she too turned and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just walked, step by step, out of that restaurant, out of that lie, out of his life. Each step was an affirmation of her own survival. Mark was left behind, a statue in the middle of the restaurant, alone, exposed. The table for 2 now occupied by only one, with a solitary wedding ring as company. The waiter cautiously approached, the check in hand, not knowing what to say. Mark didn't see him. He just stared into the empty space in front of him, the architect of a double life that had collapsed under the weight of his own duplicity, unable to explain, even to himself, how he had lost everything in a single night. The wife, Elizabeth, filed for divorce the next morning. The separation was contentious and painful. She demanded and obtained a restraining order, ensuring Mark was not present at the birth of their son, Leo. She refused to put his last name on the child's birth certificate. With the support of her family, she rebuilt herself, not as an abandoned woman, but as a fiercely protective mother, determined to raise her son in an environment of truth and unconditional love. Sarah, for her part, kept her promise. That same night, she packed every trace of Mark in her apartment, clothes, books, the watch she had given him, and left everything in boxes at the concierge desk. She blocked his number, his social media, his email. She deleted every photo, every message, every digital memory. It was an exorcism. Days later, she broke her lease, paying the penalty without hesitation, and moved to a new apartment in a different borough, a place that wasn't haunted by his ghost. She immersed herself in work, traveled alone for the first time, and rediscovered the strength she had always possessed, but which had been overshadowed by the false brilliance of the perfect man. The two women, Elizabeth and Sarah, never spoke again. Their paths, which crossed so violently, went in opposite directions, but they would forever carry something in common, an invisible bond forged in pain. They both survived the same liar. And both, in their own way, rebuilt their lives, looking not back but forward, to futures that, although different from what they had dreamed, were authentically their own. Mark, for the first time in his adult life, experienced what he had so desperately tried to avoid with his web of deceit: absolute solitude. Not the physical solitude of being in an empty room, but the existential solitude of someone who looks in the mirror and finds no one. He lost his wife, his son, his mistress, his reputation. He became an island, isolated by the waters of his own lies, and in the silence of his days, he finally understood that the only trip he would take, for a long, long time, would be inward, a painful and solitary journey to find the wreckage of the man he could have been. He caused his own end, and his sentence was to live with the ghost of 2 lives he destroyed, including his own. So what did you think? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Leave your comments telling us which city you are watching from, and subscribe to follow our next stories. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.